The wind in the hills that winter didn't whistle. It whispered like a secret long-buried clawing through the cracks in every board of Elias Boone's weather-worn cabin. 45 winters had left their mark on him, but this one felt longer. Not colder, just emptier. The kind of winter where time didn't move forward, it just circled back around the same grief again and again. Elias stood at the narrow window, his knuckles white around a chipped enamel mug of black coffee gone cold. He hadn't drunk from it, just held it, like some men held memory. 3 years had passed since he buried Marjorie beneath the bent cottonwood tree that leaned toward the creek as if bowing in shared sorrow. She'd died quiet, just a fever that wouldn't break, and the child in her womb had never drawn a breath. Elias had carved a cradle before the end even whittled a small wooden bird to hang above it. After the funeral, he burned them both. Since then, he hadn't built a thing that wasn't meant to keep something out. Fences, latches, shutters. Grief had a way of turning even soft hands into barriers. His neighbors in town, not that he called them friends, whispered about the man who only came down from the hills once a month, trading pelts and flour without more than 2 words strung together. Some said he'd gone mad with loss. Others claimed he'd always been half wild-born with too much silence in his blood. He let them think what they wanted. Elias didn't explain himself anymore. There was no one left to listen anyway. That night, as dusk gave way to a bruised violet sky, something shifted. It wasn't the kind of sound a man expects, not a coyote, not a wind chime, not even an old board groaning under its own weight. It was softer, closer, a kind of broken rhythm like breath caught in a storm. Elias stepped onto the porch with his rifle, not because he felt threatened, but because habit ran deeper than trust. He found her under the old juniper near the barn, a girl no more than 20, maybe less, curled in on herself like the cold had sculpted her that way. Her hair was dark matted with ice and dirt. One sleeve of her dress was torn, her arm slick with frozen blood from a gash that ran shoulder to wrist, barefoot, barely breathing. For a moment, Elias did nothing. He just looked, unsure if she was real or some ghost the land had spat back at him. Then he knelt, touched her forehead, warm but faint. Not gone, not yet. He didn't ask who she was. He didn't ask what she was running from. He didn't even ask if she wanted help. He just lifted her like he was afraid she might splinter and carried her inside past the door that hadn't opened for anyone in years. She smelled of smoke and river clay and something else, fear maybe, or the kind of exhaustion that lived in the bones. He set her gently near the hearth, wrapped her in the quilt that didn't carry his wife's scent, and stirred the coals until flame returned. Then, with hands more practiced than he'd admit, he cleaned the wound, stitched it shut, and placed a basin of water beside her. She didn't speak. Not that night. Not the next morning either. But she watched him, eyes sharp even in sickness. He left food near her blanket and drank his coffee at the table, his back turned, not out of rudeness, but respect. She was still a stranger, but not an intruder. There was something in the way she looked at fire, not for warmth, but for safety, that told Elias she had been hunted. By what or by whom, he didn't know. He didn't need to know. Some things a man understands without ever being told. He didn't expect her to stay. He didn't expect to feel anything. But that winter, the one that had felt endless, had just broken open. And in the coldest silence he'd ever known, someone had come knocking. Not with words. Not with need. Just breath. And that Elias thought might be enough. The snow hadn't stopped falling since the night Elias carried Asha Kanti into his cabin, and in truth, he didn't expect it to. It layered over everything outside, branches, fence posts, even the old rocking chair on the porch that hadn't moved since Marjorie died. Inside, the world was smaller, quieter, not dead but waiting. Asha lay near the hearth on a straw-filled mattress wrapped in quilts Elias hadn't touched in years. Her presence had unsettled the dust, stirred something in the air, not unwelcome, just unfamiliar. She hadn't spoken, not in words he understood. Once or twice she murmured things in sleep, soft syllables shaped like water over stone, but Elias hadn't asked her to explain. He wasn't sure he'd know what to do with answers if she gave them. Her wound had stopped bleeding thanks to his stitches, though it would scar. She moved her arm now and then, slowly testing its limits. Her breath came easier. The fever had passed. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was earned. Elias made no effort to fill it, and Asha didn't seem to need him to. In some ways, it was the easiest companionship he'd known in years. One where no one asked, no one confessed, and no one pretended to be more healed than they were. Each morning he left a plate of cornbread and dried meat beside her, never staying long enough to see her eat. Each afternoon he returned from tending the animals and found the plate cleaned, the quilt refolded with care. She was observant. That much he knew. He'd caught her once studying the bookshelf in the corner where 3 volumes sat untouched, one Bible, one worn veterinary manual, and one small book of Comanche stories that Marjorie used to read aloud when the nights were long. Asha didn't take it down. She just looked at it the way someone might look at a locked gate, recognizing the shape of it, not yet certain of the key. That first week they moved around each other like 2 ghosts who hadn't yet decided if they haunted the same house. Elias kept to his routine, hauling water, checking fence lines, mending the barn roof where it had started to sag. He tried not to look at her too often, not because he didn't want to, but because when he did, something in him shifted like a window cracking after too many seasons of frost. She was quiet but never timid. Her silence wasn't submission. It was chosen. One afternoon he returned from the ridge trail, his boots caked in slush, to find the hearth swept clean and the stew pot soaking in a basin of warm water. She'd taken it upon herself to clean, though she hadn't touched anything of Marjorie's. The shawl still hung untouched on the back of the chair. The worn apron still dangled behind the door, but the floor was swept and the dishes were stacked with a neatness that spoke of intention, not duty. That night they ate at the same table for the first time. No ceremony, no small talk. Elias ladled out stew beans, jerky dried onion, and placed it in front of her. She dipped her head once in acknowledgement. Her fingers moved carefully, and he noticed she chewed only on the left side of her mouth. Bruising, maybe. He didn't ask. He'd seen enough hurt in his time to know that some pain needed time before it spoke. The wind picked up after sundown, howling around the cabin like a thing that had lost its name. He stoked the fire higher, gave her the bed again without comment. When she rose sometime after midnight, her silhouette sharp against the firelight, he didn't pretend to sleep. She stood by the window, peering out into the dark with eyes that didn't blink, searching, listening. "You expectin' someone?" Elias asked, voice rough from disuse. Asha turned slowly. Their eyes met for a beat too long, then finally a single nod. Elias didn't press. He just pulled an extra blanket from the cedar chest and handed it to her. "You'll stay tonight," he said, his tone not quite a question. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She didn't answer, but she didn't fold the blanket and return to the bed either. Instead, she stood by the fire and watched the flames curl upward. Her posture relaxed but alert. He took his seat in the rocking chair and watched her out of the corner of his eye, not possessively, just attentively. Like a man who had seen a storm before and now recognized the smell of it in the air. That moment held. Neither of them moved for a long while. The fire crackled between them like a third presence alive, shifting necessary. Somewhere in the flicker and the silence, Elias realized something had changed. Not with her, not even with the cabin. With him. The silence no longer felt like mourning. It felt like beginning. The third morning came wrapped in stillness, not the soft kind that settled gently on a home, but the kind that pressed down heavy like breath held too long. Elias Boone knew the land well enough to sense when something shifted. That morning the woods beyond the ridge were too quiet. No crows called. No rabbits stirred the brush. Even the breeze that usually stirred the cedar branches seemed to have knelt in silence. He stepped onto the porch with a steaming tin cup in hand and scanned the distant tree line. At first he saw only snow and shadow. Then just at the horizon's edge, the shimmer came a disturbance in the air, the faint ripple of movement too synchronized to be wild. He set the coffee down and reached for the spyglass he kept above the door, the brass tarnished with age, but the lens still clear. Through it he saw them riders, more than 24, approaching in slow, deliberate formation. They moved like water carving a canyon, unhurried but unstoppable. He didn't see weapons raised, but he didn't need to. Their silence was more threatening than 1,000 rifles. These weren't lost travelers or scouting trappers. These were Comanche, and they were riding with intent. Elias stepped back inside, quietly shut the door, and glanced toward Asha Kanti. She stood already barefoot on the cabin floor, braiding her hair with steady hands. She didn't look at him, but her posture said she knew they were coming, knew it had always been a matter of time. "They're not far," Elias said, not because she needed warning, but because speaking it aloud made it real. She nodded once, then reached for the leather strap she'd been using to bind her arm. Her movements were composed, almost ceremonial, like someone dressing not for flight but for reckoning. There was no panic in her face, only a quiet, settled kind of readiness that made Elias ache in a place he didn't know still lived. When the horses came into full view, cresting the ridge with sunlight glinting off bone ornaments and war paint, Elias stepped out again. He didn't carry his rifle this time, not because he didn't feel the threat, but because this wasn't the kind of standoff a weapon could fix. Beside him, Asha stood tall, chin-high shawl wrapped tight against the wind. They waited together. The riders fanned into a wide semicircle around the cabin, their formation precise and unhurried. At the front rode a figure cloaked in black wolf fur, mounted on a gray mare adorned with feathers and bells that didn't make a sound. His face was painted with vertical red lines, streaks that fell from his eyes like war-born tears. He didn't dismount, not at first. He just stared. Then he spoke, his voice a low, steady current of language that Elias didn't understand, but Asha did. She stepped forward and answered in kind, her voice clear, strong. No tremble, no apology. "He is my father," she said quietly to Elias, though her eyes stayed on the man. Elias didn't respond. He kept his gaze locked on the chief, a man whose presence filled the frozen air like fire would fill a dry barn, Tahanis. That was his name, Asha had whispered once more, breath than word. Tahanis finally dismounted his boots, crunching softly in the snow. He walked toward the cabin with the slow confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and yet everything to reclaim. When he stopped within reach of Elias, there was no handshake, no greeting, just a silence heavy with history. "You sheltered her," Tahanis said in English, his voice carrying the weight of stone. "I gave her a place to heal." Elias answered evenly, "She belongs with her people. She belongs where she chooses." Tahanis turned to his daughter, speaking again in his tongue. Whatever he said, it didn't soften her. She looked at him not as a daughter pleading, but as a woman standing firm. "I did not run from my people," she said, switching to English so Elias could hear. "I ran from the ones who chose silence over justice, from men who let harm stand because tradition told them to." Tahanis's jaw clenched, but he said nothing. Instead, he studied Elias again, this time longer, measured, as if looking not for threat but for truth. "I will not strike today," he said, "but I will return. In 3 days, As a father, yes, but also as a chief. And then he turned mounted and rode off without ceremony. His warriors followed, snow churning beneath hooves. Within moments, the clearing emptied. Only tracks remained, hundreds of them circling the cabin like a noose drawn tight but not yet pulled. Inside, the fire had dimmed. Elias stoked it absently. Asha sat at the edge of the bed, her face unreadable. She didn't ask what he thought. He didn't ask what she feared. Instead, they sat in the hush between storm and choice, knowing 3 days had been given, and every hour of them would cost something. In the stillness that followed, the rider's departure time took on a different weight. The days no longer drifted, they ticked heavy and loud in Elias Boone's chest. 3 days, the Comanche chief had said. Not a threat, not quite a promise, more like a boundary drawn in the snow. And now every sunrise carved deeper into the unspoken question hanging between him and Asha Kanti. What will we become by the time that line is crossed? They spoke little in those days, but they moved around each other with growing familiarity, like two people learning the shape of silence when it wasn't used to push others away. Asha no longer hovered in the background. She swept the hearth without prompting, filled the water basin, and gathered kindling with sleeves rolled to her elbows, and purpose in her step. Elias noticed the way she folded the blankets now, tighter corners, cleaner edges. Not like a guest trying to make herself useful, but like someone preparing a space she had decided to belong in. She didn't ask him about the rifle above the door or the faded photos tucked into the bookshelf. And Elias didn't question the scar at her jaw or the piece of deerskin she wore as a bracelet, one she never removed, not even to sleep. They gave each other space, but within it something rooted. There was a rhythm to their quiet now. He chopped wood. She boiled beans. He mended a torn saddle. She stitched new seams into her tunic using the blue fabric he'd bought on his last trip to town. When he left it on the table one evening without explanation, she only brushed her fingers across it, then tucked it carefully away without a word. That single gesture, her acknowledgement, his offering, held more intimacy than any confession. The mornings were cold, but their routines carried warmth. One day, Elias returned from checking traps and found her near the chicken coop, crouched low, coaxing a hen with a few broken crumbs. It was the same mean-spirited bird that had bloodied his palm more than once. Yet it took food from her hand without flinching. He watched from the fence for a long moment, arms crossed, chest tight, with something he didn't yet have a name for. She turned slightly, as if sensing his gaze, but didn't speak. She didn't have to. That moment, quiet, shared, unremarkable to anyone else, felt like a thread stitching them together. Later that evening, she brought in a small basket of dried herbs and asked with the softest hesitation where Marjorie had kept her jars. Elias blinked. It was the first time she'd spoken his wife's name aloud. He nodded toward the shelf and stepped back, giving her room. She moved carefully, rearranging nothing, only adding her own bundles to the empty spots. There was no claim in her actions, just respect. Elias watched her longer than he meant to, then stepped outside to breathe the cold back into his lungs. By the second night, he noticed she hummed, sometimes low and tuneless, usually while she worked with her hands. Once he sat beside the fire while she carved into a strip of antler, shaping something round and smooth with the tip of a bone knife. She didn't explain what it was. He didn't ask. But when she set it aside and leaned her back against the edge of the hearth, her shoulder just brushing the fabric of his pant leg, he didn't shift away. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. Not from worry, from something else. Restlessness wrapped in warmth. He sat up and whispered into the room without thinking. "Did you have a name for her, the woman you used to be?" There was a long pause before Asha answered. "I had many names. None of them were mine." She shifted beneath the blanket but didn't turn away. Asha was the one I chose when I left. And Kanti. She hesitated, then said, "My mother's name. I carry it so I don't forget she lived." Elias nodded into the dark. "Then that's who you are." He heard her breath shift. The silence didn't return as a wall it softened, curled between them like firelight touching skin. Neither of them spoke again that night, but when morning came, Asha was already outside stacking wood, her braids swinging against her back like punctuation to a statement she didn't have to make. That afternoon, he handed her a coil of rawhide and asked if she knew how to make reins. She didn't answer with words, just took the leather and started working. Her fingers moved with certainty, and as he sat beside her tying knots into fence wire, the quiet work between them became a language neither had to translate. There was no ceremony, no proclamation, but something had been exchanged. In the space between firelight and fence posts, cooking pots, and carved bone, they were no longer strangers passing time. They were becoming something else, not lovers, not yet, but something deeper. They were building a trust no storm could tear down. And it was happening not in grand gestures, but in every quiet act no one else would ever see. On the third morning, the sky was the color of forged steel, flat, cold, and tense, as if the clouds themselves braced for something final. The wind had shifted overnight, brushing the cabin from the north with a bite that didn't just chill skin, but stirred instinct. Elias Boone stood on the porch, wrapped in a wool coat, watching the eastern ridge with quiet reserve. The land was no longer sleeping. It was waiting. Inside the cabin, Asha Kanti braided her hair back with slow, precise fingers. She'd redressed her bandaged arm with fresh linen and now moved with a purpose that belonged to warriors and women who no longer asked permission. The tension between them had softened over the last days, but today it returned, not mistrust but awareness. They both knew this day might cost them something. "You still think they'll come?" Elias asked. "They'll come," Asha said, her voice calm. "They never say something unless they mean it, not like your people." That wasn't an accusation, just fact. Elias accepted it with a nod. He didn't clean his rifle, he didn't sharpen his knife. This was not that kind of fight. Instead, he laid a pot of coffee on the stove, placed 2 cups on the table, and waited. They heard the hoofbeats just before noon. No war cries, no dust cloud, just the steady thunder of inevitability rolling toward them. Elias stepped out as they crested the ridge, dozens of riders once more, but this time in a tighter line. There was no surrounding formation, no performance, only intention. The chief Tahanis led them, mounted on the same gray mare with feathers braided through its mane and jaw set like stone. He dismounted without ceremony and approached alone. His wolf fur cloak swayed with the wind, but his voice was steady as he stopped just shy of the porch. "You were given your 3 days," he said. "I counted them," Elias replied. Tahanis's eyes flicked toward Asha, who now stood in the doorway. Her presence alone made the air shift. She didn't hide behind Elias. She didn't plead. She simply stood as someone who had made a choice. "I asked her to return," Tahanis said, looking at Elias again. "She refused. That makes her no longer of my fire, but still of my blood." "She's not held here," Elias said. "She stays because it's hers to choose." Tahanis studied him with an expression too old for anger, but not without weight. Then he reached into his belt and drew a curved blade, not as a threat, but an offering. Its handle was wrapped in leather worn smooth with years, and its blade etched with symbols so old the meaning had passed into legend. "A man does not earn a daughter by standing still," the chief said. "He earns her by walking, hunting, knowing the cost of silence and blood." Elias didn't answer with words. He stepped forward, took the blade, and nodded once. They rode out together, Elias and Tahanis, two men who shared no language but both carried the weight of the unsaid. The warriors did not follow. Only the sound of hooves and wind accompanied them as they rode into the snow-bound hills where the trees grew denser and the ground dipped low with shadow. Their hunt was not about the deer, not truly. It was about endurance, about observation, about watching how a man stepped over fallen limbs or read the wind in the sway of the pine tips. They tracked quietly, each step a test, each glance a measure. Hours passed. The silence between them didn't break, it deepened, thickened with mutual understanding. When they finally came upon the deer, a young buck poised and alert near a stream bank. Tahanis motioned for Elias to take the lead. Elias raised the bow Asha had restrung 2 days earlier. He didn't overdraw. He didn't hesitate. He simply waited for the breath between the buck's heartbeats and let the arrow fly. It landed clean behind the shoulder. The buck stumbled, dropped, and did not suffer. Tahanis said nothing, but when Elias turned, the chief offered a single nod. Respect, not approval, equal, not granted. They carried the deer between them back to the clearing where the warriors waited in the same oance they had departed in. Snow had begun to fall, fine and dry, like the land was exhaling. Back in front of the cabin, Tahanis spoke. "You are not of us," he said. "You do not speak our prayers, but you do not look away from what must be done." Elias said nothing but met the man's eyes without flinching. Tahanis turned to Asha. His voice softened, not in tone but in meaning. "You are no longer of my fire," he said, "but you are not forgotten from my heart." He touched 2 fingers to her forehead, then to his own, an old gesture older than language. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and signaled for his warriors to ride. No weapons had been raised, no blood spilled beyond what was offered. And yet something sacred had happened, a choice honored, a bond shifted, a path unblocked. As the hooves disappeared into the trees, Elias looked to Asha, who still stood in the doorway, her arms folded against the cold, but her gaze open and calm. He said nothing. Neither did she, but the world and what they meant to each other had changed. The morning after the Comanche riders disappeared into the tree line, the world felt lighter, not in any grand, obvious way. The wind still bit at the shutters, the snow still clung to the eaves. But the silence that had once pressed like a stone on Elias Boone's chest now felt like air, again cold, but breathable. He stood by the barn bridle, looped over one shoulder, a bucket of feed in the other, watching the chimney smoke rise in a clean, confident line. The cabin no longer looked like a tomb. It looked like something lived in. Inside, Ashakanti moved through the narrow space as if it had always been hers. She wasn't careful now, not in the way guests are. She didn't tiptoe, didn't ask permission with her eyes before touching something. She didn't hum either, but her movements had rhythm, the kind that came from knowing one's place in a space. She chopped herbs and tucked them in small cloth pouches, stacked wood without being asked. Cleaned the old oil lamp without ceremony. That morning, Elias noticed she'd unhooked Marjorie's shawl from the chair and folded it carefully into the trunk at the foot of the bed. In its place, she now wore her own, stitched from scraps with a strip of blue cotton sewn carefully along the hem. The same cloth he'd brought back from town. It wasn't replacement. It was memory transformed. He left something for her, too. Not big, not loud. Just a small bundle on the table by the fire, a carved necklace with 3 bone beads smoothed and oiled with care. His mother had worn one like it. He hadn't thought of that in years. Asha didn't comment when she found it, but later that day she wore it tucked beneath her tunic, visible only when she bent to reach something and the neckline shifted. That was how Elias knew she'd accepted it, not just the gift, but all of it. They began speaking more, but only when words added something. He told her about growing up on red soil in Missouri, how his father taught him to mend harnesses and his mother taught him to listen more than he talked. He spoke of the war, though only in outlines, not of glory or valor, but the kind of scars that made a man quiet. She told him about the river she'd been born beside her mother's cooking pot, always filled with sweet root and smoked trout, the songs they sang during the berry harvest. Stories traded like seeds, not forced, not watered down, just planted and left to take root. When Elias rode into town a week later, Asha rode with him. Not behind, beside. She wore her shawl like armor and met every stare with unwavering stillness. The general store was quieter than usual. Mrs. Whitlow, stiff-lipped behind the counter, glanced between them as Elias laid out his goods. Flour nails, dried fruit, an extra tin cup. The woman didn't say anything at first, just rang the items up with clipped precision. "You brought her back," she finally said, glancing at Asha like she was both question and caution. "She's not a thing to bring." Elias replied without looking away. "We came together." Mrs. Whitlow huffed softly. "Folk won't take kindly." Asha stepped forward before Elias could answer. "They don't have to," she said, her voice even. "Kindness isn't required. Respect is." It was the longest sentence she'd said in public. It was enough. Back at the cabin, they began to build a rhythm that felt nothing like survival, and everything like living. Asha taught Elias how to read the trail, not just by hoofprint but by grass memory, how bent stalks told stories of weight and time. He showed her how to work the lathe in the shed, how to plane a plank smooth for furniture. They repaired the back fence together, side by side, trading tools without speaking. One night, Elias brought a small bundle of cedar planks inside and laid them near the hearth. When Asha asked what it was, he hesitated. "A cradle," he said at last. "This time, I'm going to finish it." She didn't smile, but her hand reached for his firm and sure. She placed it on her belly, which had begun to round just enough to notice. "She'll need it," she whispered. I dreamed of her last night," Asha said. "She had your eyes and my mother's laugh." The fire popped, and Elias didn't speak. He only nodded and got to work sanding the edges smooth. Each day after, something else shifted. The town didn't change overnight, but it blinked as if maybe, just maybe, it was starting to see them not as scandal, but as people. Mrs. Whitlow set aside a swatch of soft wool, said nothing, but left it where Asha would find it. A neighbor boy from the edge of town asked if Asha could teach him how to fletch arrows. Change came slow, but it came. One evening, as sunset bled across the horizon in long lines of firelight and shadow, Elias sat on the porch and watched Asha hang a blanket to dry. Her hair was braided, her sleeves rolled up. The baby moved beneath her hand. She didn't hum, but she didn't need to. The peace between them was music enough. He looked down at the nearly finished cradle and then out across the land, golden with dusk. "We built this," he said aloud, not to her, not to himself, just to the air that had once carried only sorrow, and now carried something else entirely. Spring arrived not in trumpet blasts or bursting flowers, but in small, defiant ways, a softening wind, the sound of water running again under the frozen creek, the faint green threading up from beneath the old snow. Elias Boone felt it in his joints and in his chest. In years past, spring had marked the end of survival. Now it marked the beginning of something else entirely. The cabin no longer echoed, it breathed. Laughter didn't ring out loud, but it hummed beneath daily tasks, in the way Asha Kanti corrected his posture when he carved, or how she scolded the goat that kept testing the gate latch. She moved through their shared world with a quiet certainty now. The girl who once stood in his doorway with blood on her arm and snow on her lashes had become the woman who planted seeds behind the cedar tree. the same one she'd nearly died beneath and now called it hers. Elias watched her often without needing to speak. There was something holy in the way she touched the earth, the firewood, even the cracked teacup she insisted on using each morning. Not fragile, not saintly, just rooted, like she had reclaimed space in the world with each breath. In town, people still whispered, but the tone had changed. Where once there had been suspicion, there was now curiosity, even reluctant respect. When Elias announced in his usual simple, quiet voice that he and Asha would be married beneath the cottonwood, no one dared speak against it. Not because they agreed, but because they had seen the steadiness, the way he reached for her basket when her hands were full, the way she stood just slightly in front of him when strangers approached, how they didn't cling, they accompanied. They wed without fanfare, no preacher, no papers. Just her hands in his forehead against hers, and the cedar tree swaying above like it remembered. Asha wore no veil, just her mother's necklace and the blue-threaded shawl she'd made herself. Elias gave her a ring carved from antler, the one she'd shaped into a circle months before without knowing why. There were no vows, only breath, only presence, and that was enough. They didn't talk about forever. They talked about the fence that still needed mending, about names for the baby, about whether the peach tree behind the shed might fruit this year. They lived in days, built in hours, loved in touches and looks and shared work. And in the final light of that spring day, as the wind stirred the cradle, Elias had finally finished, and the scent of wild sage drifted through the open window. The story that had once begun in snow and silence now found its home in warmth. Not rescued, not owed, but chosen. Every nail, every stitch, every word unspoken but understood. A life not born of conquest but consent. A love that asked nothing except to stay, and stay they did. Some stories shout to be heard, others whisper, and it's in that whisper we find the deepest truths. Elias and Asha's journey wasn't about grand gestures or perfect timing. It wasn't about saving or being saved. It was about what happens when two people, both broken in different ways, choose not to walk away. It was about building something real in the silence left behind. By loss, something steady, deliberate, and sacred. In a world obsessed with fast fixes and loud declarations, this story reminds us that healing often comes in quiet acts: a meal left beside a fire, a shawl stitched with memory, a cradle carved for a child who hasn't yet arrived. It teaches us that love isn't proven in what we say, but in what we continue to show up for, even when no one else is watching. It also reminds us that belonging doesn't have to be inherited or granted, it can be chosen. Asha wasn't claimed. She claimed herself. Elias didn't need to rescue her, he only had to make room. And in doing so, they created a space where both of them, ghosts of who they used to be, could begin again. So wherever you are in your own journey, remember this. The most powerful love doesn't demand. It invites. It doesn't bind, it frees. And sometimes it begins not with fireworks, but with a door left open and someone brave enough to walk through. If this story stirred something in you, if you found a piece of yourself in Elias's silence or Asha's quiet strength, then Frontier Reverie is where you belong. Here we honor the forgotten corners of the American West, the love stories forged in dust, fire, and forgiveness. Every week we bring you new tales of redemption, chosen family, and the kind of love that doesn't shout, it stays. So if you believe in second chances and slow-burning trust, in building something beautiful from the broken, subscribe, like this video, leave a comment. Tell us what part of this story stayed with you. And above all, remember, in the vast silence of the West, even a whisper of love can echo forever. Welcome to the firelight. Welcome to Frontier Reverie.